Last year we had a 50th anniversary celebration. It was construction was actually the facility started in 1973 to commemorate Nicholas Copernicus' 500th birthday. We opened to the public in 1974, and last year had a wonderful gala downtown. And now we are sort of looking toward our next 50 years. So we are a public observatory. We are also a STEM education facility. So we do, during the school year, we do a lot of school programs, both here as well as on the road. And right now, we're actually in the middle of our summer camp program. We just finished our, was it third week, fourth week? Yes, one of those numbers. I was on vacation. I took a rare vacation last week, so I'm still catching up. But it's been a lot of fun, a lot of high energy here in the facility here. We've got more coming up over the next 5 weeks or so, including camps on virtual reality, augmented reality. We're doing a camp next week on 3D design. We've got 3D printers that kids are going to start to learn how to use. I do a program it's called Return to the Edge of Space. It's where the students will build a payload that we put on a weather balloon that we launch from here. It will then go up to over 100,000 feet, where the balloon finally bursts, and then hopefully gently return to Earth with a parachute. We then send a recovery team out using some ham radio tracking equipment to return that payload. We always fly cameras on it. This year we're going to fly a Geiger counter to see what kind of cosmic ray exposure we get as you get higher and higher in altitude. So a lot of fun, our summer camps. But every Friday night we do, from March to mid-December, we always do a public program like this. It's an opportunity for us to really explore things maybe outside of our own wheelhouse, learn how things work or how things don't work. And not everything we talk about is about astronomy. As you can see from our website here, tonight's program is on what's causing butterfly decline. But if you go to, well actually I'll point out, we've got a 5K road race that'll happen in September. So if any of you are runners or even walkers, if you can walk, you can do the race. And so you can go to our website to check that out. But one of the things, again, about these Friday night programs is it's an opportunity, again, for us to learn about something new. We live stream all of our programs now, and so literally people from around the world will be watching. There's often a woman in Adelaide, Australia, Lindsay, who for her right now is 10:30 in the morning, Saturday morning. So she just finished breakfast and is cleaning up, but will be watching our live stream. And so it's great to have that wide coverage. We now our YouTube channel, which if you go to YouTube and just type in Kopernik Observatory and Science Center, you can actually see the last 5 years worth of programs. So a couple weeks ago we had one on the summer skies, beginning telescopes, Planet X, the Galapagos Islands. We've had high school robotics teams up in here. Talked about AI, science and religion. And Winter Skies, we do a very large winter star party, and but along with our Friday night programs, occasionally we will do live streams of various astronomical events. So when there's a lunar eclipse or coming up as a Perseid meteor shower, if the skies permit, we may do a live stream of that. And actually, back in March, there was a lunar eclipse that happened. I don't know if any of you caught it. You would have had to have gotten up at 2 in the morning. But Jenny, our live stream astronomer, did, and actually took a 1 minute compilation of the lunar eclipse. It didn't happen this fast. It happened over a couple of hour period of time. So there she changed the exposure so that we could actually see the eclipse when it's totally eclipsed, like where we are right now. Again, that redness is what you're seeing is light refracting through Earth's atmosphere, and it's the low wavelength light that actually finally makes it through, which is why we get that blood moon. It's not the end of the Earth. At least, so far it isn't. So anyway, this is the kind of thing that that we can do. We now have close to 14,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel, and it's a great outreach resource for us. But we are here today to, let me see if I can stop this. There we go. To talk about butterfly decline. Again, we're very fortunate to have just an outstanding university here in Binghamton University, and we've had many of the faculty there, some of which are here actually, that have presented on various topics. And tonight we have Dr. Eliza Grames, who works is an assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Binghamton University, to talk about her work looking at this and what might be causing butterfly declines. But I would also say is that at the end of this program, if the skies permit, and I think we have a reasonable chance of that, we invite you to go out into the to check out the night sky through our domes, through our telescopes. Also, a little bit after 10 o'clock, there's going to be a pass of the International Space Station, so we'll be able to point that out to you as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to change the. Do I need to talk about anything else? I think I covered it. All right. We're going to change the display over to Dr. Grames's computer and let you take it from there. So you want to turn on your?
Yep, should be on.
You're on? Okay. All right.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
And it's not projecting anything. Perfect. Okay, there we go. So thank you all so much for coming out and spending your Friday night with me to talk about butterfly declines. What is still going good. So as Drew said, my name is Eliza Grames. I'm an assistant professor at Binghamton University, and research in my lab group focuses on kind of understanding what causes populations to decline and what makes species more at risk of going extinct, and also what can we do about it. So really focused on conservation. And before I came to Binghamton University, I was a postdoctoral scholar out at the University of Nevada in Reno, which is where I started a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today, and why there will be kind of a strong leaning towards the western US as opposed to the eastern US, because that work is just getting started. And long before I was a postdoctoral scholar, I grew up in northern Wisconsin. So this is a picture from trail cam, actually from 1 week ago today. My mom sent me this picture because she was so excited about this really, really great picture of the sandhill crane, which it is. It's a great picture. She's also sent some less great pictures of like deer just walking into the camera and bears just knocking into it. But I thought this was really great because it kind of captures where I grew up. So I spent my childhood running all around these fields, looking at the butterflies, looking at the plants and the birds and everything there, and that was what really kind of shaped my interest in ecology and conservation. And one of the butterflies that I remember in particular from growing up in northern Wisconsin is this species, so the European skipper. And as you can probably guess, based on its name, it's not native to North America. It was introduced accidentally in 1910. So there was a shipment of timothy grass seeds that was sent to London, Ontario, and it had eggs of this skipper species in the seeds. And then all of a sudden, they were established and rapidly spread across most of eastern North America. And they became one of the most abundant species. So I would see hundreds of these as a kid. And in some places, people would say, you go out, you count this one species of skipper, there was more of this butterfly than all the other butterflies if you added them up. So super abundant. And its host plant is timothy grass, so that was why it was in the seeds. And timothy grass also introduced to North America, so settlers brought it over partly to farm as hay for livestock because it grows really quickly. And so since I was on this old farm, no surprise, there's timothy grass absolutely everywhere too. And so really good conditions for this species. And I would see so many of them on red clover. no surprises, it's also introduced, where pretty much every red clover flower all around the field had one of these butterflies on it. And what we found in this recent analysis is that from 2000 to 2020, this species declined by 92%. Right, 92%. That's a massive decline, and that's over only 20 years. And so that means for every 100 of these butterfly that I saw when I was 9 years old running around the fields, there's 8 of them left. It's a lot of empty clover flowers. And so you might ask, well, it's an introduced species. It's not native to North America. Why should we care that this species has declined 92%? And the reason that I think this is really important is because this is a species that should be doing really, really well. All the species that are introduced, not native to North America, they should be doing the best. You pick them up, you take them from Europe, you stick them in Canada, all of a sudden they're all over North America. They're generalists, so they can really kind of thrive anywhere. And so they should be pretty resilient to any environmental change and able to withstand it. But nope, they're declining really, really steeply. There's actually kind of a parallel story in bird world. So house sparrows, which are also introduced, they're the kind of laser beam sounding little brown birds that can persist even downtown. They've been tanking. So their populations are declining really, really rapidly. And so I think it's really concerning that we're seeing declines in these really generalist species, because many of our native species are a lot more specialized. And we have been seeing declines also with our native species. So from the year 2000 to 2020, we've lost about 1 out of every 5 individual butterflies in North America. I should say in the United States. We only looked at the lower 48. And this isn't species that have lost, but individuals. So the total abundance has declined by over 22%. On the x-axis here is the year, and the dots here show the mean count across all the different surveys people did at monitoring programs in the US from 2000 to 2020, and the bars show kind of the error there. And so we've been losing a ton of our butterflies. And one thing about this figure, and the reason that I extended the x-axis so far back, is that we know about what's happened since the year 2000, but we don't really know how many butterflies did we lose before 2000, or before 1990, or even much farther back. So one of the questions I'm really interested in is actually how many butterflies would there have been, would I have seen running around those fields if I was there when the original farmhouse was built in 1881? Like how many butterflies could they possibly have had if we can still stand to lose this many? So that's kind of the context for where I want to talk about this research. And I want to step back now to where did we get this number? How do we know that it's 1 in 5 butterflies? Back in 2022, there was a Status of Butterflies of the United States working group formed. It was funded by the U.S. Geological Survey and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and hosted at the USGS Powell Center out in Fort Collins, Colorado. And it was this really rock star group of butterfly biologists and climate modelers and people who know the policy side of things. So it was led by Cheryl Schultz, you can see there with the little orange arrow. And I put a little Fender's blue butterfly next to her because that's a species that was critically endangered in the year 2000. And she spent most of her career trying to understand just like the basic biology of this animal. And through a lot of her work to really understand its habitat needs and its population dynamics, it was downlisted and now it's threatened as of 2023. So still not in the clear, but no longer critically endangered. She was one of the working group leads along with Elizabeth Crone and Wayne Thogmartin. And then I've also highlighted Ryan Drum because Wayne and Ryan are 2 federal scientists who have done incredible work on monarch status and recovery. And so we had this really, really great group of people who came together to try to figure out what is the status of butterflies in the United States. And so the first question, which seems like a silly question that we had to answer, is what are the butterflies of the United States? How many of them are there? Which species are we talking about? And so we built range maps. So if you think about like when you look in a field guide and there's an outline showing where a species occurs, we took all of the range maps for all of the butterflies of North America, and we overlaid them on the lower 48. We decided we weren't going to care about Alaska and Hawaii for the butterflies of the United States. And it turns out that there's 650 butterfly species in the US, which is a lovely, neat number. It's, not 651, 652, just 650. Also, there's 750 in North America. How does that work out? I don't know. And you can see kind of the patterns here. We've got, around 150 butterflies in a lot of the eastern states. Really, the hot spots of butterfly biodiversity are down in South Texas, towards like the Rio Grande Valley. There's a lot of species in New Mexico and Colorado. And so there's some biological principles that make us pretty confident in this pattern, because that's how we know where species occur. And so the first of these, and yes, there will be a quiz at the end of these ecological principles, is the idea of the elevational diversity gradient. And so as you go up in elevation, you get fewer species. Think about the top of Mount Everest. There's not a lot of species up there. And this idea has been around in ecology for a long time. So pictured here is Alexander von Humboldt. He was an explorer and a naturalist, largely active in the early 1800s, and he traveled all around the world to these mountains and then drew diagrams like this showing what was the vegetation like. So he's interested in these patterns of vegetation, and he would notice that in these tropical mountains you'd have kind of a rainforest down at the bottom, and then it kind of shifted to smaller and smaller vegetation until you end up at the top with a snow-capped peak and very few species. But the nice thing, if you're an ecologist, I guess, about this gradient is that you're getting a lot of different habitats in a very small geographic scale. So even though there's fewer species as you go up, there's more species across this gradient than you would get in kind of one same geographic area, but that's flat. And so we see this with the western butterflies, especially looking at a map of species richness, where the yellow is more species in relation to the topography. So you can see in California there's that kind of band, which is along the Sierra Nevada, and then you can see the Rocky Mountains, and especially where they're especially tall in New Mexico and Colorado and up into Montana. So this matches our expectation as to where we would expect to see butterflies. And then the second general ecological principle here is the latitudinal diversity gradient. So this is a phenomenon that ecologists have been studying for decades, maybe centuries, and it's this consistent pattern where when you're at the equator, you have the highest biodiversity, the most species, and then you lose species richness as you go towards the poles. So we have very few species at the tundra and down towards Antarctica, and the most in these really biodiverse tropical areas. And so that's where we see that kind of signal of southern Texas having a lot more species than the rest of the US, because it's closer to the equator and shares a lot of species with Central America, which that's going to be important later. So we have these 650 species. We know roughly where they occur. And the next thing we had to do is to see if there was data for these species that we could analyze. This is a screenshot of iNaturalist. So these are community scientists, people who've taken pictures of species in their backyard and uploaded them to iNaturalist as an identification. And right here I'm showing the observation map for this Yajoa scrub hairstreak. And this is one of the 650 butterfly species that is on the list of ones that occurs in the US and whose range intersects the US, but you can see it's not really a US butterfly, right? This is a Central American butterfly, mostly in Mexico, that sometimes comes into the US, so there's not enough data to actually fit a trend and see how well it's doing, and there was a lot of species like this. And so we pulled together all of the data of all the butterfly monitoring programs anywhere in the United States. That's 35 different monitoring programs, largely run by volunteers and community scientists or agency folks who had done 76,957 surveys. It means almost 77,000 times people went out, counted all the butterflies, wrote the data down on paper or a spreadsheet, or somehow they kept track of it, and they've still got it organized and ready to go. And across all of those surveys, people counted 12.6 million butterflies. So there's just a lot of data going into this analysis, although maybe 500,000 of that is just monarchs, because people love to count monarchs. Of the 650 species that we have, 554 had any data. So that means there's, got to do quick math in my head, 96 butterflies that occur in the US that aren't captured by any monitoring program. A lot of these are the ones that are in kind of southern New Mexico, right over the border, where people aren't doing a lot of research. But we had 372 species that had enough data that we could figure out what their trend actually was. And so the results that I'm showing you are for about 57% of the butterflies that we have. And across all of these species, 13 times more butterflies had declined from 2000 to 2020 than had increased. This figure that I'm going to show, the y-axis, is the annual percent change. So not the total percent, but every single year. And then I'm going to show all 372 species as a vertical bar, colored by whether they're declining, stable, or increasing. That's a lot of species that are declining. So everything there in this kind of orangish red are species who have been declining over the past 20 years. And then we've got the small portion that are increasing or doing fairly well. And then I also wanted to point out kind of the width of the bars here is how confident we are in the rate of decline for that species, because some of them we have a lot more data for than others. We also wanted to look within different regions. So how are butterflies doing in the northeastern part of the US, so where we are here, versus the Pacific Northwest or any of the other fish and wildlife regions. And so this figure again shows the annual percent change. This is across all butterflies in a region and only includes the species that occur in that region. And so this is the mean estimate, and then this bar here, that's the confidence interval. And so quick statistics lesson, the confidence interval means that if you went out and we repeated this experiment 100 times, 95 of those times we would get a number that's in this range. So if we went out and we collected 12.6 million butterfly observations times 100, every time that we recalculated it, it would be in here. And so if it doesn't cross 0, we're pretty confident that that's what the estimate should be. And you'll notice that only one region, so the Pacific Northwest there, up top, the confidence interval overlaps 0. So we can't say for sure whether butterflies in the Pacific Northwest are increasing or decreasing. But in all other regions, they're decreasing, and they're decreasing the most steeply in the Southwest, which is the part of the country that's warmed up and dried out the fastest over the last 20 years. Yeah, it is. It's an annual percent change, so it's compounding. Every single year, you lose a little bit more. And we also looked at how not just the abundance of butterflies changed, but the diversity. So if you were to go out and do one of these surveys, how many butterflies might you expect to see on a really good day or across the span of the summer? And so on the left here is the expected species richness, so the total number of different species you would see on a survey in 2000 compared to 2020. And every line here is going down, right? So we're seeing declines across all regions in species richness, and especially in the southwest and southeast regions. So the regions that had the most species to begin with are the regions that are losing species at the fastest rate. But of course, not all species are declining. We saw some that were increasing over this time period. This is one of them, the mournful dusky wing, which increased by 194%. So that's a tripling of the number of this butterfly that people saw. And there was 9 species that were definitely increasing. They weren't overlapping the potentially 0 change. Of 9 of them, 3 of them had more than half of their range in Mexico. So these are really southern species. And what we think is happening here is that with climate change, as things are getting warmer and the conditions in the Pacific Southwest are more similar to Mexico, these species are expanding northwards. So they're migrating, they're able to persist outside of their native range, and so that's why we're seeing increases, because they couldn't previously survive in parts of Texas that are now much more similar to their kind of climate niche. So a similar story with this zebra heliconian. It's mostly a Caribbean species, or in Mexico, but it's expanded and it's increased 91% over the past 20 years, largely because parts of the southeast are a little bit more similar in terms of temperature and precipitation to the Caribbean now. But again, I ended with some of the winners in this story. Most species, most butterflies are not doing well in the United States. We've still lost 1 out of 5. And I'm coming back to this question here of, what did we lose before the year 2000? Like, what was the population status in the 1990s? And for that is another kind of core concept I wanted to emphasize, which is the idea of a shifting baseline syndrome. This is an idea in conservation biology that every generation we learn what the state of the natural world should be, what the state of the environment is, based on our earliest childhood memories. So we form a perception and then we accept that that's natural. So my idea of how many butterflies there should be, what's natural, comes from the 1990s in northern Wisconsin, and other people might have a much longer understanding of what's been lost. And so this is really important for conservation, because if we have kind of a degraded baseline, we have this generational amnesia where every single generation is forgetting more and more about how many species and how abundant they should be. We're really not going to set our conservation targets high enough. We're not going to restore to the historic baselines. We might restore to some kind of degraded state of the environment. And so the story I want to tell about shifting baseline syndrome is set here, out west in the Sierra Nevada. This is Donner Pass, kind of at the border between California and Nevada. And yes, it is that Donner Pass of the Donner Party. And the reason we know so much about the Donner Party is because of this book, The History of the Donner Party, which was written by Charles McGlashan, who's pictured here with his daughter Jimena. And he wrote it based on interviewing the survivors of the Donner Party, and was kind of a prominent historian, lawyer, politician, you name it, in Truckee, California, but has a bit of a complicated, as with many historical figures, bit of a complicated legacy. That's why I put a little asterisk here. He was also the leader of the anti-Chinese immigrant movement and expelled all people of Chinese descent out of Truckee, California, and then went on tour around the state of California to tell other people how they too could also do that. And that's kind of had a really lasting legacy, where now it used to be about 30% of Truckee was people descended from Chinese immigrants, and now it's 1%. And he also loved butterflies. So along with his daughter Jimena, who is the 6th of 7 daughters, he published this magazine called The Butterfly Farmer. And in it they would document kind of the butterflies of the area, what they could see. And in 1914, they published a checklist of the butterflies of Donner Pass, and they said that there are 86 species at this site. And so that's kind of one of our earliest understandings of the butterfly biodiversity present in Truckee, California. And then about 50 years later, the Emmels went and surveyed it. So the Emmels were 2 brothers, Thomas and John, and they would frequently go out on these collecting trips, observe the natural world, do kind of ecological note-taking and record-keeping. This is Tom Emmel, pictured in 1949 when he was 8 years old. And so that means that when he published the checklist in 1962, he would have been 21 years old. And I think John would have been 18. And when they went to Donner Pass, they found 76 species. So it's 10 fewer than what was potentially there in 1914. And of course, the immediate question that comes to mind is, did we really lose 10 species from this one really biodiverse site in the mountains in just 50 years? And so there was someone who asked this question and got interested in it a few decades later, which is Art Shapiro. So Art Shapiro is a professor at University of California, Davis, and he knows everything about Western butterflies. He has been monitoring the same set of 11 transects that go from kind of the Central Valley of California all the way up into the high alpine and the Sierras since 1972. Every 2 weeks, all summer. And I have been told that in the early years, actually, no, the entire time maybe, he doesn't have a car. So he's relying on public transportation to get to these sites, or grad students who would like to get his advice and pick his brain, to get to these sites every 2 weeks for 50 years. So it's one of the longest butterfly monitoring transects or data sets anywhere in the world. And in kind of recent decades, 2 new generations of naturalists have picked up some of the sites. So Matt Forrester took over the monitoring of the high alpine sites in the Sierra, along with the grad students in his lab, including Chris Hulsh, who is now a postdoc at Binghamton University in my lab. And so these 3 really know the Western butterflies. And so Art sees this checklist from 1914, and something doesn't sit right with him. Because in 1998, he published a checklist for Donner Pass that had 72 species, so a lot more similar to the EML list. And so he started digging into this old checklist by the McGlashans, and he figured out that there was actually 33 species that were completely unique and only appeared in the McGlashan checklist. 19 species are new in the modern checklist that the McGlashans didn't report as being in Donner 111 years ago. And so, based on all of his knowledge about these butterflies and the amount of time he spent out observing them, he tried to figure out kind of why, like what are the discrepancies here? One of his hypotheses is that the timber industry had changed a lot. So in the 1890s, early 1910s, timber was the main industry in Truckee, and so there would have been a lot of logging, which might have opened up a lot of early successional habitat, which butterflies like. Although he kind of ruled that one out because other sites that had a similar history weren't showing the same changes. He thinks there's a few species that the McGlashans might have misidentified at the time. They might have had a different idea of what the Truckee area was, so rather than restricting to kind of the area right around Truckee, some of the species he said, those are kind of specialized on habitat that you find a couple hundred miles away, like much more down into Nevada. But the main reason probably is that the reason that the McGlashans published the Butterfly Farmer magazine was partly so that people would come to Truckee and hire them as their butterfly guides. And so they're advertising, look at all these incredible species that you can see if you come to Truckee. There's so many of them, it'll be great. Even if you might not actually see them once you're there, then it's, shoot, you missed a rare species. So we didn't really actually lose 10 species over those 50 years, and you can't really use that historical record to kind of track really long-term changes. But Art has been monitoring these sites since the 1970s, so that we now have 50 years of data for these sites. And one of the questions that Chris is really interested in is, what have we lost in the most recent 50 years? So what has disappeared since the 1970s? And Chris is a really, really great field biologist. His goal in life is to spend as much time as he can in the mountains chasing butterflies, which he spends a lot of time chasing butterflies in the mountains. As far as I know right now, he's living in the back of his truck somewhere in the Great Basin chasing butterflies. And then he checks in every few weeks and when he gets cell phone service. And so he really knows these butterflies pretty well. He's also really quantitative, and so he does a lot of the data analysis with this data set. He was going through analyzing it one time and he noticed this outlier data point and thought, this can't be right. Because he came across this just kind of surprising statistic, which is that on June 8th of 1992, Art Shapiro went to Donner Pass and he saw 62 species of butterfly in one day. that's a lot of butterflies to see in one day. You know, the checklist had about 72, but that's for the entire year, not a single day. And also, it's June, which is well before when the peak butterfly days usually are. And so he thought, is this right? He emailed Art. Art got back and said, yeah, I remember there was one year that was really, really good when I was monitoring. And so he wanted to dig in and figure out what on earth could have possibly led to this day happening. And so he had two hypotheses. So one of them is that the phenology was somehow special in 1992. So phenology is the timing of life history events for species. So if you think about like when the first birds arrive in the spring, when the birds leave in the fall, the first flowering date of a plant in the spring. So we thought maybe there's something changing with the phenology, that butterflies were out earlier this year than you would expect. And also, maybe Art just saw a lot of really rare species. Because to see 62 species, maybe he just got really lucky, and somehow every single rare species was there that day. And so he defined the rare species as species that are out, or that you see in less than half of the years, so 50% of the time. And this graph that I'm going to show you on the x-axis is the ordinal date, so starting with January 1st and ending with December 31st. And it's going to be binned into those 2-week time periods, and the color shows the probability of detecting a species. So one super dark red there, you're almost guaranteed to see the species, and then white, it's really, really rare that time of year. And then each row is one of the species. And so these are all the species that you could possibly see at Donner Pass, is each one of those dots. The black dots are the ones that Art saw on June 8th, 1992, which we jokingly call Art's Big Day, and I think it would be an excellent children's book. I really do. I think it would be great. It could be all about shifting baseline syndrome and how we've lost so much biodiversity. And it would feature Art running around with a butterfly net. So anyways, the black dots are species that we're seeing. And you can see that a lot of these dots, they're before you would expect, right? The phenology is to the right of when you actually observe them. And so it's things that are occurring a lot earlier than you would think, and also some that are really, really rare. And so that kind of explains what happened in 1992. But then this got us thinking about like the broader question of what's happened to these really excellent days, like, you know, the best day of the year that you go home and you brag to your buddies about, well, I saw 47 species that year, how many did you see? And so we pulled the best day of every single year and looked at how the number of rare species were there on that day, and also how that day related to species phenology. And so the phenology now is a little bit different. So 0.5 means that you saw a species right in the middle of its flight window. So exactly when you'd expect it to. To the left of 0.5 is it was flying early, and to the right it's after kind of the peak that you would expect to see it. And it turns out 1992 really was just a complete anomaly. There was a ton of rare species. He saw one species that it's the only day it's ever been seen at Donner Pass. It's the only record for that species there. So many species were flying early. And most of the other years, the best day, it's kind of a combination of rare species and phenology, but it's not both of those things at the same time. So he really did just have a great day. Chris took all of this data and fit a simulation model to kind of predict what are the chances of this. And he ran it 1 million times because he was thinking, he's like, well, this has got to be like a 1 in a million, right? Nope, 0 in 1 million, never happened in any of the million simulation runs. He didn't get anywhere close to the model spitting out 62 species as a possibility. So it really was just that incredible of a day. But based on these simulation models, he could see what's the expected best day of the year. And so the distribution here is kind of showing, yeah, you might expect, so for example, down here in 1978, the best day was about 48 species, but the best day, based on what had been happening recently, what happened over the past 5 years, you might expect between 40 and 50 species, because that's where most of the distribution is. And you can see that this has really declined over time. So starting from the 1970s up to the 2010s, the best day of the year has really declined quite a bit, to the point where now people who go out and start observing in 2020 would see fewer than 25% of the species diversity, and really not actually even realize that that change had occurred if we didn't have this long-term data set. And Chris also binned this by decades. So if you were a naturalist who started observing butterflies at Donner Pass in the 1980s or 1990s, you would be really excited about a good day that was 45 to 50 years, or not years, species. That's a good day. You'd probably be pretty disappointed if you went out and the best day of the year you only got 35 species. You know, that's not what you're accustomed to. Whereas the generation of naturalists starting in the 2020s, that's their idea of a great day. They would be bragging so much if they saw 35, 36 species in a single day. Whereas that's, you know, not much if you started observing earlier. So, we've talked about we've lost so many butterflies, and I bet you're all wondering why, right? I did title this talk something about what's causing butterfly declines, and I just babbled about old monitoring efforts. So, there's a lot of different drivers of insect decline, and I kind of summarize some of them here. So the number one driver of species decline, not just for butterflies, but for all insects and really most species, is habitat loss. So when we take away their habitat, there's nowhere left for them to live or survive. This picture here shows kind of some milkweed in the front, which of course is the host plant for monarchs, and in the back it's corn monoculture. So when you remove native vegetation, native wildflowers, any native habitat, and replace it with agriculture, development, what have you, you're going to lose species. And then there's climate change and all of the different effects that we see with that. So flooding is a driver of insect decline that people haven't been paying a lot of attention to, but there's a new working group led by a postdoc up at Cornell, Eliza Grames, who's trying to bring together all of the literature and figure out what actually is the effect of flooding on insects. And it's really interesting. So I, of course, well, being in Binghamton, we think of flooding as there's too much water in the river and it's onto terrestrial land. So I think about insects are dying, they're drowning, they're not able to survive, they can't get away from the flood. But the working group has a bunch of aquatic insect researchers in it, and they said, oh, no, flooding is a problem because it creates connectivity. You get floods, now there's two different ponds that are connected, you can get predators moving between ponds, species get washed downstream because they can't hang on to the substrate. And so it turns out that there's a lot of different ways that flooding affects insects, including removing oxygen from the soil. So even in areas that aren't covered by floodwater, there's so much inundation underwater, or under the soil, that there's not enough oxygen for things that like nest underground. Of course, drought is a really big driver of insect decline. Drought is kind of a twofold effect because not only does it desiccate species, so insects are tiny, right? So they have a really high surface to volume ratio, you know, big outside, not a big inside, so they dry out really fast. And then it also affects their host plants. So you can get kind of loss of host plant availability, so they're losing food resources in drought conditions. And then, of course, extreme events. Anytime there's something that's a natural disaster for humans, you can bet it's also a disaster for the species that are living around us. Pesticides are another driver of insect decline. So pesticides are pretty pervasive. If you think about kind of like an aerial application, there can be drift, so pesticide ends up in kind of neighboring habitat, not necessarily just in the field. And so the switch to kind of seed-coated insecticides is supposed to solve that problem. But there's still a lot of pesticides that get outside of agricultural crops. So with the seed coats, you lose about 2 to 3% comes off as dust when planting, and so that can get picked up, become airborne, and spread to adjacent habitats. About 2 to 3% actually is taken up by the plants and functions as an insecticide, but 90%, like over 90% of the insecticide ends up in the soil and the water. And as soon as it's in the water, that means that it can spread to anywhere, essentially. So people have done studies, actually when I say people, Matt Forrester, who's one of the people who does the Western butterfly monitoring, has looked and put out, you can get these like little bracelets that people can wear to see how many pesticides are near them for like human health concerns. So he got some of those bracelets, which are supposed to be for tracking people's health, and put them out in some nature preserves to see how many pesticides you would find out there. And there are pesticides even in protected areas that are supposed to be well away from agriculture. And of course, pesticides, since they're designed to kill insects, are pretty effective at doing that. There's an analysis by Braden Van Daens, who is part of the Status of Butterflies working group looking specifically at the butterflies in the Midwest. And he found that pesticides, more than agriculture, more than land use change, more than climate change, they were the #1 driver of declines. So the dashed line here is 0. To the left of it would be a negative effect, and to the right is a positive effect. And you can see that neonicotinoids especially have a really strong negative effect on species richness. I also put in artificial light at night. So this isn't really necessarily a problem for butterflies, but it's a problem for moths, and they're Lepidoptera too. And also a lot of other species that are active at night. So artificial light at night, some of the key problems with it is it causes species to kind of lose their sense of time. So it's this temporal disorientation. It's daylight all the time to them. There was a really great study done in the UK by an entomologist named Doug Boys, where he looked at caterpillars in hedgerows under streetlights and not under streetlights to see what the differences were. And the caterpillars under the streetlights didn't stop eating. They just kept eating because it was still daylight. And so they ended up way bigger than they should have been, whereas the ones under no streetlight recognized that it was night and they stopped eating. So could potentially have some big physiological impacts there. There's also a lot of insects that navigate based on moonlight, and so they'll get attracted to lights and then not be able to orientate, and they'll just keep going in circles, essentially unable to escape the light, so it's really wasting a lot of energy and time. And then other species, especially predators, have learned about this, right? So bats and spiders, they know if you go to a light source, there's going to be a lot of delicious moths there and other insects, and so there's really high predation at lights. So those are some of the drivers. There's hundreds of drivers that people have proposed, but those are some of the biggest ones, and they're also the ones that we can kind of do something about. So I've brought back our shifting baseline curve here, because it's not just about thinking about what do we not remember that we've lost in the past, but also if we're setting conservation targets, what do we want to be building towards, and how can we get back to kind of 1950s biodiversity as opposed to continuing on this kind of downward trajectory of losing species. So I compiled a list of 10 things that individuals can do to help insects, because who doesn't love things that come in list form, right? So one of the easiest ones, especially for those of us who are in charge of mowing, is to change how you mow your lawn. Mow it a little bit less frequently. That way you're letting the flowers have time to bloom. Those provide really important floral resources to butterflies and bees and all sorts of other pollinators. You can also wait until after wildflowers have bloomed to start mowing, so give them a chance to eat all of the delicious nectar from the April and May wildflowers before you mow them down. You can also just leave a little part of your lawn unmowed. Doesn't need to be a big bit, just like maybe the back corner, the weird little angular bit where you kind of have to mow it a really weird way. You don't have to keep mowing it. You could just leave it for the pollinators, right? And then also cutting grass at a higher height. So there's a lot of insects that kind of use grass as shelter. And so if you just adjust the lawnmower height, like the blade up a little bit, it leaves a lot more habitat for them, kind of these little micro habitats that they rely on. You can also just grow more native plants. So a lot of the plants that are for sale for kind of gardening and landscaping are ornamentals, so they're introduced, not native to North America. And the big problem there is that our butterflies don't know that those are food, right? So even like there's a butterfly bush, which is really popular plant for butterflies, because I mean it has butterfly in the name. adults will go to it for nectar, but the caterpillars can't eat the leaves. So it's really only helping one life stage out, so it's a little bit of a trap. So we should focus on planting native species. You can also sow little wildflower meadows or pollinator gardens. So if there's kind of a weedy area that you already aren't mowing or don't want to deal with, or like ditches or shrubs, throw some wildflower seeds in there, or plant a pollinator garden. I also do have a bunch of wildflower seed mixes which are native to the northeastern US here if anybody wants some. You can kind of sprinkle them wherever and let them grow. So often we focus on kind of, providing food, making sure there's flora resources. We got to think about the whole life cycle of insects, and providing nesting sites can be really important. So a lot of, often we think about honeybees, colonial bees. Most of our best pollinators are actually solitary bees. So like this little solitary bee, they nest in kind of bare, undisturbed soil. Interestingly, one of the best places for them is cemeteries, because the soil is really easy to excavate, because that's why we put cemeteries there. It was easy for us to dig, and it's also easy for bees to dig. But you can just leave a little bare patch of dirt, and you'll get some solitary bees. Don't rake the leaves. Save yourself the time of doing it. It provides really important cover and kind of microhabitats for insects to survive the winter. And then you can also just kind of like put a pile of sticks in the corner of the yard, probably the easiest thing to do. And yeah, it's a little wildlife brush pile. Bees will nest in here. You'll sometimes get like bunnies and things. It's a great place for cocoons. So it just provides some of those really small microhabitat structures that insects need. Can also, of course, reduce herbicide and pesticide use. So, limiting how much household pesticide use. You don't necessarily need to spray everywhere. Eating more local and organic produce, because that will, of course, reduce pesticides in the broader landscape. And then, leave the weeds. A lot of the species that we think of as weeds are actually some of our native species. Dandelions are not, but you'll still see a lot of little sweat bees on them. And so, leave them if you can. Limiting artificial light at night to kind of help out the nocturnal insects. There's some easy things to do here. So one is to put lights on a timer. I've put kind of this picture of a porch light on the left there, because no one's outside. There's no reason that the porch light needs to be on when no one's out there to use it, right? We only need to put on lights when we need them, so putting things on a timer or sensor is a really good idea to limit artificial light, or kind of sheltering it, so putting kind of little covers so that it's less attractive to insects at a broader scale, and then trying to use some of the dimmer lights, or warm colors. For aquatic insects, reducing water pollution is really good. So there's so many species that, we might not always think of dragonflies as an aquatic insect because we think about them, flying around. But in their life stages, they're these really cool looking aquatic insects. And so trying to, limit how much ice ends up in ponds. There have been studies up in Canada that have found that the amount of salt in ponds near roadways is, more than twice the legal limit, and it has really strong impacts on dragonfly development, so they're not developing properly and not emerging as adults. Trying to reduce soap runoff outdoors, mostly through car washing, and then, preventing kind of microplastic pollution. So these are just kind of generally good things to do. And then I think it's really, really important to cultivate future naturalists, right? So getting kids outside, getting them excited about insects and to really love insects and not think of them as something that's scary. And so I think iNaturalist, I mentioned it a few times, it's a platform where you take a picture of a species, maybe you saw it in your yard, maybe even in your house or wherever you see it, and when you upload it, it'll suggest what it might be. So kind of like an idea of, oh, okay, it's probably this kind of caddisfly or something. And then you can choose what you think it is, and other people will then look at it. So it's this big community platform and say, oh, no, it's this species or it's this. And there's people who have these very specific usernames where it's like caddisfly guy 520 or something. And you post a caddisfly, you don't know what it is, and within a few minutes, some expert on caddisflies somewhere in the world comes in and they put in there like, oh, it's exactly this species. Or they'll come in and tell you you're completely wrong, one of the two. So it's a great way to learn about some of the species around you. And yeah, just get outside and look at insects, because we need people who are going to be the future naturalists, documenting biodiversity, and hopefully also remembering kind of the historical context. And then these last three I'm going to put on one slide because I only had one bullet point for each of them. But of course, you can be an advocate for insects, support policies that are going to benefit insects and other wildlife, either directly, so things like listing status, making things protected, but also indirectly. Clean water legislation goes a long way for insects. You can support conservation organizations. The Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation is always looking for sort of volunteers or donors or people who want to participate in their programs. They're the largest insect conservation organization, but there's tons of other groups. And of course, if you're doing any of these things, tell your friends and family about why you're doing them. Like, why have you all of a sudden started running around your yard sprinkling seeds everywhere? Maybe they would actually want to do that too. So it's always a good chance to educate other people. And I think, if more people do these kind of little actions, there's actually a chance for insects to bounce back. I think that's one of the great things about working on insect conservation is they're already kind of living on the edge of a knife. They have these really big changes in populations. And so little actions that you do, you can see a benefit almost immediately, like the next year. So they really, really can come back. And so I think all together we could really help these little things that run the world come back. And with that, thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Grames. Do we have any questions out here in the... Oh, here we go. Give me a second.
Thanks so much. Really interesting. I noticed you started out by talking about the total population of butterflies declining, but then pivoted really quickly to talking about species instead. Why is that a more interesting thing to study?
Well, so one of the reasons to focus on species as opposed to the overall status is that for policy, it has to be at the species level. So if you want to put in kind of like habitat restoration or get things listed on the Endangered Species Act, it's at the species level. So we're not, the way conservation is always operated, I guess partly because a lot of the early efforts were focused on these large vertebrates, was we need to do something to protect this species as opposed to we need to do something to protect all of the butterfly habitat. And so that's kind of how it's codified in law. One of the things you can do though is you can pick a species that needs a lot of habitat that other butterflies also need. So based on some of this work, there have been petitions put in for some of the West Coast species where I think, which one has a positive finding? Eucloausonites, so the large marble, it kind of ranges from Canada, actually all the way up in Alaska through Canada, all the western US. And so if it ends up getting listed on the Endangered Species Act, all of that butterfly habitat is protected, which will also benefit all the other species that are at the same site.
All right, any other questions? I've got one actually. We talk about doing a survey. How do you sort of try to figure out how many, I mean, you can count the number of butterflies or any objects that you're going to see, but do you sort of then extrapolate, say, okay, well, I looked over a 2-acre area and I caught 13. Well, maybe if I've got 100 acres or 200 acres, can I say you just scored? Is that basically how they?
Yep, yeah, so the kind of the two main types of data that went into the analysis and the way that people often count butterflies. So one of them is a pollard walk, which is named after this guy, Ernie Pollard, who started walking this way, and now everybody walks that way, which is that you walk in kind of a transect, you know how long it is, and you try to observe all of the butterflies in like some imaginary volume around you. So you're like, all right, if it's more than 5 meters that way, I'm not going to count. If it's more than 5 meters that way, and if it's more than 5 meters above me, so you're kind of walking in a box and trying to keep track of what 5 meters is. And then you walk a set distance, and then you say, okay, I have this many butterflies per cubic air, I guess. And then you could extrapolate that out to the broader area. And then the second one is, which was a lot of the data that went into the analysis, are the North American Butterfly Association butterfly counts. So it's a community science thing where every year around the 4th of July, people go out and they try to count as many butterflies as they can within, I forget if it's 15 kilometer, 15 mile, but this set distance radius circle. And so you just run all over this circle, basically trying to count as many butterflies in like a 15-mile area, and then extrapolate from there.
All right, interesting. Oh, got a couple of questions back here.
I did the North American Butterfly Association counts for many, many years, and we were not allowed to extrapolate. We had to actually only count what we did see, to just keep that in mind.
Oh yeah, we do the extrapolation after that. When we're trying to scale up to like the level of the fish and wildlife regions. Yeah.
This might sound crazy, but are butterflies only plant eaters?
No, they will eat. Oh, fruit is plant, isn't it?
They're not considered a predator. And where would they be in the food chain? And has this reduction affected any other species?
I think there are a few species that eat blood. Julian is.
Yum yum.
I don't know why I'm looking at you for this one, Julian, but I think they're. I wouldn't say that they're all 100% plant eaters. There's always exceptions in butterfly world and insects in general.
There are a few that do actually eat blood.
Okay.
But they're not around here.
Yeah.
Last I knew it was limited to Southeast Asia. But amazing. They go for wounds on things.
Yeah.
And
Has the reduction in butterflies changed anything in the food chain?
Yeah, so in general, butterflies are going to be fairly low in kind of the food web, mostly eating plants, and mostly eaten when they're caterpillars. But actually, in terms of their total contribution to trophic webs, moths are so much more important. I shouldn't say that because butterflies are beautiful. We all love butterflies. But they're not nearly as abundant as moths and also not as palatable. So most of like the caterpillars that birds are feeding to nestlings are moth caterpillars.
sort of food plants for caterpillars.
Oh, yeah, I think like invasive plants and ornamentals have been really problematic for butterflies and other insects. There's very few butterflies that have been able to switch, so it's like the rare example where someone will say, oh, we've actually found this butterfly on an introduced plant. So yeah, especially like when you have things like barberry spreading through and out competing all the native plants, you're not going to have lots of insects in those areas.
So, a question here. Are there American species of butterflies that have gone around the world? And how are they doing?
Monarchs are
And I got another
everywhere.
What's that?
Yeah, monarch butterflies are everywhere. There's some of the more like tropical species. I think one of the heliconians, really orange Julia heliconian, I think it is. It's introduced everywhere. So especially like sometimes there will be butterflies that are part of like a butterfly house or a butterfly exhibit and then they escape. There's also an instance somewhere, I forget where in East Asia, but there was a bunch of butterflies that were released as like a wedding display and got established. So yeah, they get around and then they establish, especially the ones that are more generalist.
Okay. And another question. Like years ago when I used to belong to the bird club, I used to help out with several days. Everybody would go and get a section of the community and you go out, you count birds and the numbers of species. But, you know, my knowledge was nowhere near as good as some of the other people. So like when I was helping out, there was a lot of species of birds that I didn't know what they were, so you can't really put them down. So with over 600 species of butterflies, and all the people that go out and do this, what are their qualifications and what kind of training do they get? Because a lot of things could be missed if they don't know what it is.
Yeah, usually within one of the NABA sites, there's usually one local expert who knows all the butterflies in the area, and they're the one counting them and calling out and saying, oh, there's this over there, that over there, and a lot of people who participate are just there to see some butterflies and not necessarily know what they all are. But in general, yeah, the community science programs are run by like the local naturalists who really know their species.
I have a question, and I almost feel silly asking it, because this is about butterflies, and everyone loves butterflies. But there are insects that are harmful, very harmful to humans, mosquitoes, West Nile, and in parts of the world. You know, I've had friends die in tropical areas from insects that cause disease. So what are the entomologists thinking about things like ticks and bees that attack?
One of the really tricky things, and I actually, thank you for asking this question. It comes up a lot when we're talking about insect decline, because a lot of people, their first thought, they hear insects are declining, and they go, great, fewer mosquitoes. But the species that we don't necessarily want to have around, the pests and the disease vectors, they're doing pretty well under all of the same types of change. So with climate change, we have those tropical mosquitoes spreading up north. Ticks are moving northward. And that same climate change is causing a decline in the species that we want to have around, like the butterflies. And it's also, you know, like even in really heavily urbanized areas where you have very few species, the species that you have left are the ones that are associated with humans. So like if you're in Manhattan, there's gonna be like 4 species of mosquitoes and they're all gonna wanna bite you. Out here, there's gonna be a lot more species of mosquito and they're not all going after humans. They're going after deer or birds, you know, they're not really specialized. And so, you know, people think like, oh, we're gonna get fewer mosquitoes. It's like, no, you're just gonna have a lot more that you don't want. And then also when you have that kind of reduced abundance of the other mosquitoes, you don't have as many species coming in to eat them. So fewer bats in the area because there's less food for them, but they're still the nuisance species. So yeah, there's a whole branch of entomology focused on kind of disease modeling and transmission and agricultural pest management. And they're working their hardest to figure it out.
All right. If there's any other questions, we can also, you know, if you would, stay here. And I think you said you've got some seeds here that